Hello and welcome to What's My Tagline. I'm your host, Carol Flagg. Thanks for tuning in today. On this show, we put our microphone in front of a variety of industry experts to understand the factors influencing messaging, branding, sales and marketing, and reputation in healthcare. You can follow the conversation on Twitter at hashtag What's My Tagline and follow me at Carol Flagg. Back with me again are national sales trainer, speaker, and author of The Perfect Close, James Muir, and James Bogue, the Chief Growth Officer at Xtelligent Media. On this episode, we have a follow-up conversation to prospecting in the technology era and ask our two guests if the art of closing the sale has changed with technology. James, Jane, thanks for coming back. I feel like the band is back together again.
Thanks for having us on, Carol. Here we are.
Here we are. Well, seriously, the episode we did together was so popular. I just felt the need to have you back. I actually may have you like a recurring guest like every quarter or something. But before we start in, let's remind our audience of your taglines from our last conversations, or if you want to, throw out a new tagline, that's good. Either way, Jane, you cannot take James's tagline. So James, we'll start with you.
Well, my tagline is the same as it was last time, which is I make the complex simple.
Yeah.
Sales shouldn't be complicated. When it's done right, it should be both fun and easy.
Jane?
And I'm going to stick to just make it happen. Where I'm all about delivering results and delivering results for both the company I work for as well as for the clients that I work with.
Yeah. And I'm a recent friend, I guess, and colleague of James, but I've known Jane for quite a while. And yes, you definitely make things happen. You're no doubt about that. So also remind our audience briefly about your backgrounds. Jane, let's start with you this time.
So I've a 20-plus year media veteran. I've been in the B2B space for basically since I started my career. I started out in trade shows working in the Gulf of Mexico and internationally doing trade events in different industries, the oil and gas industry, and the commercial fishing industry, the seafood industry, then gravitated or moved over to the digital media space and was the digital sales director for a division of the Seattle Times company, and this was back, I'm dating myself, but it was earlier in the internet phase when newspapers were still quite vibrant, but and digital was just a bit of a speck, and I was responsible for driving change through the organization as well as product development and the embracing of the digital channel from an advertising perspective, both from the sales team as well as from the vendor community and the advertisers. I did that for a number of years and then moved back into the B2B space and have been in healthcare media ever since. So now I spent some time with HIMSS Media as their VP of Sales and Business Development, and now I am the Chief Revenue Officer at Xtelligent Healthcare Media, where I oversee both product as well as business development and revenue growth.
Great. James, remind us of your story.
Wow, well, I was just thinking I might qualify as a healthcare geezer now. So I've been in healthcare for 30 years.
We are all in the same boat, floating down the river together.
We're like the Grateful Dead of bands. Yeah. I started out in rev cycle management. My father owned a chain of rev cycle companies. Back then we called them billing services. We didn't call them rev cycle. And so I learned about rev cycle, right out of high school. And I used to go with the sales team as a subject matter expert until we opened up an office at a remote location. And that's when I got drafted into sales. So I'm an accidental salesperson, and I didn't intentionally seek to become a salesperson, but it turned out that was definitely my niche. From there, I spent 10 years working for a well-known provider of rev cycle management software as an application specialist, and then spent after that another 16 years with NextGen Healthcare, where we did electronic health records, revenue cycle software, and full outsourcing of revenue cycle management. And today, what I do is I help healthcare organizations with complex B2B sales improve their sales.
Yeah, that's great. And as I mentioned earlier, the author of The Perfect Close, which you obviously can find on Amazon, and I hope our audience does. So before we talk about closing, I think we should revisit real briefly the last conversation we had, which was talking about the challenges and opportunities of prospecting in a technology-driven sales and marketing era. Now, certainly, we're all, as we said, we're sort of, all floating down the old man river together. But we all remember the days that, and certainly when I was a sales and advertising manager, prospecting was walking the pavement, knocking on doors, and certainly, of course, picking up the phone and calling. And technology has changed that. And so, if you guys could, kind of refresh our audience memory as to how technology has changed the prospecting environment for salespeople, and maybe talk both the good and the bad. But I mean, there are obviously a lot of opportunities, but there's some challenges too.
Well, I can address that. When you look at the data, you can boil down the top two challenges that selling has to just two things: opening and closing. The data shows that salespeople are pretty good about managing the middle part of the sales process, but they still have a lot of challenges when it comes to prospecting and closing. And how technology has changed that is, in terms of the prospecting, it's changed it massively because the means by which we connect with people are very different than we did before. There's a lot more gatekeepers, a lot more barriers to connecting with people, and there's a lot more channels to touch them with, right? The golden rule is to meet them where they are. And so we need to find out where our customers are, and then we want to be engaging on those channels. And what that means today is we need to be on LinkedIn, we need to be using Twitter, we need to be using these different social channels, but we also need to be attending trade shows. For example, I'm working with a company that does shift scheduling for hospitals, enterprise shift scheduling, and most of the other channels don't work very well for them. They get most of their results out of events because the executives that they speak to are so busy that they just email is they get low openership on their emails, and they're not fully represented on all the social channels. So they can get a little bit of a focus out of those prospects when they're at an event. So I don't know that there's a surefire channel for every single type of a product or solution out there. I think you need to look at where your audience is and then engage them there. But definitely there's a lot more channels today than there has been in the past when it comes to the opening part of the sale. But I think when you get down to the closing part of the sale, the fundamentals of what it takes to actually advance a sale to closure really haven't changed much at all. In a complex sale, there's just a lot of little steps, right, on our way to the big close. So it's important that we have an understanding of what those little steps are so that we can help the customer take all those little steps on their way to the big one. And Neil Rackham he's the one that coined this phrase. He called those advances. And so what we want to do is just make sure that we're going into each engagement with an ideal advance and a couple of alternatives so that we have we get momentum on every encounter, right? It's always continually moving us towards that ultimate close. But I think that's how, technology has definitely more affected the outbound and the engagement process in the opening stage. And I would say the human factor is just as important as it ever was when it comes to the closing part.
Yeah, and Jane, if I remember correctly in our last conversation, you had quite a bit to say about the issue of prospecting for your staff and how technology's impacted that. So let's have you refresh our memories on that as well.
So I think from where I sit, Carol, it's I think the technology has allowed us to be a lot more intelligent about who we reach out to and how we reach out and how we're connecting with people. So the ability for both the salesperson as well as for the buyer to be more educated on the front end, that seems to be where the biggest impact I've seen. The Internet has changed the buying process for a consumer and for a B2B buyer, and so that they're doing a lot more of where a salesperson would interact or be of value years ago. Now that that consumer or buyer is educating themselves much more thoroughly before they are ready to engage with a salesperson. So I think, from where I sit and from what my team does and what I've done, you need to be very calculated with how you are approaching someone. We want to make sure that we are coming in with a very concise value proposition and how we can help the client and make sure that we really have at least a pretty thorough basic understanding of what they do and how we can help in order to get them to engage.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting. I wanted to just share a real quick anecdote with both of you. The other day I was talking with a former colleague of mine, also in the same boat that we are from a generation standpoint, and he's working for a big tech company, and he got into a sales role there, sort of a second career. He was a career salesperson and manager like me, and so they set him up, and the first thing he started doing was he started calling everybody on the phone, right, on their lead list instead of emailing them. And everybody around him was like shocked, because he actually spent his time calling people on the phone. Of course, he had the phone numbers from the lead list. Obviously, we generate leads all the time that come to the system that people give us their phone numbers. But still, all the younger folks around him were like, you're just not going to email these people? He's like, no, I'm going to call them and try to engage them on the phone. And he's like been this immediate success with closing. It's so funny,
It is funny, and it is interesting to see the generational gap and the call reluctance, which is something that I think everybody struggles with, because it really is a mix of outreach that, as James said, you have to meet your clients where and you have to cater to how they want to be communicated with, and I don't know, I'm sure I speak for everybody on we all get buried in email, and that's not the greatest way to approach me, because if it goes below the fold, I'm probably not going to see it unless it's urgent. So you got to use a multi-pronged approach, whether it's social or LinkedIn or even Twitter or over the phone or via email to try and get my attention.
Yeah.
So a newer approach that kind of falls into that same thing is called a combo, and Tony Hughes is the author of this concept. But if a person has multiple channels, right? So Carol uses email and she's got a phone number, and we might have that, and we know she's active on Twitter or something like that, or on LinkedIn. All within the space of maybe 4 or 5 minutes, we can engage every one of those channels in some way, and that actually sends a much stronger message than just trying to choose one channel and hoping that that's the channel that they're going to use. So it's being a little broader in our approach. I think the key to making that work is you need to have a message that you can retool in the 3 different ways or whatever the channels you're using quickly, right? So you're not recreating this message each time. You don't want each engagement to take 30 minutes of prep work. Otherwise, you're not going to get through too many prospects on the outbound side.
Right. Yeah, and that other issue that you talk about, sort of the the engagement side of it. We work obviously in an environment where virtual meetings and relationships, we do it all the time, right? Whether personally on Facebook or Twitter, we are virtually connecting with people that we consider not just potential customers, but potential colleagues and peers and friends, without ever meeting them face to face.
Yep, that's the new reality that we're at. In fact, I was just literally before this call was on with Tripler Hospital in Hawaii. I don't know when I will connect with those people, but we've essentially gone through the entire process without ever having been in the room together with each other. It's all been remote using technology.
That's disappointing, because a face-to-face visit to Hawaii sounds really appealing to me.
I kept begging for that meeting.
Well, that is a great segue into what we're the rest of our conversation here today. And of course, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to What's My Tagline. And my guests today are speaker and author James Muir and Jane Bogue of Xtelligent Media. So the close. All right. So Jane, you both talk about the steps, the advancement, the relationship development. These are all, of course, linchpins in the sales process. How is technology changing, quote, the close, which, getting people to that final step? And again, we work in a virtual environment, a very heavy digital tech environment these days.
Well, again, I think that in terms of the closing, in a complex sale, most of the fundamentals of what it actually takes to close the sale haven't really changed too much at all. So while we're using, there are certainly more channels, and those channels of communication give us the ability to establish trust at a much earlier stage than we did, and we were able to do that at scale. The fundamentals, though, of what it actually takes to advance a sale, that is to move it forward and help coach the customer through the process, that's kind of the same as it always has been, in that you just need to understand what the steps are that the customer needs to take and help them through that. I think the key is there's a lot of dysfunctional closing processes or techniques that are out there. I mean, In fact, a statistic that maybe is worth noting is that 50 to 90% of all sales encounters end with no advance or no close attempt made at all. There's no attempt to advance the sale in any way, which is unbelievable, right? That's terrible. It depends on the industry, but 50 to 90% is terrible. So at best, half of your meeting is going anywhere. Yeah. So if you ask me why is that happening, what I would tell you is that virtually all of the techniques that have been taught out there on how to advance a sale, to close a sale, are all dysfunctional and manipulative, and salespeople, they're just not comfortable using them. So rather than use a technique that they're not comfortable with, they just end up doing nothing. And that's why most of these sales encounters end up with no advance taking place at all. So I think the key here is just advance the sale in a way that it doesn't create any pressure. It's non-confrontational, and it's all facilitative. If you can learn how to do that, then the closing process is really easy. Instead of being intimidating, which it is for a lot of people, it's really a very simple process. You're a little bit like a coach, and just like we'd all like to have a coach that would help us through whatever goals we have, health goals or whatever, our customers are really seeking that from us too as salespeople. So kind of maybe take the sales hat off a little bit and put more your facilitator hat on, and that's really what it takes to close in today's more complex sale environment.
I love that facilitator coach sort of mentality. I remember, again, even back in the days when I was a sales manager and in the retail sector, and most of my staff, they were out, pounding the doors of the restaurants and clubs. But I always said, make sure that you're having a peer-to-peer conversation with the prospect. You're talking about things that impact them. You're not just hurrying the conversation and saying, this is what we have to offer, this is why you should buy this ad to drive these results.
Yeah, and that gets actually to what Jane was saying about how having your value proposition and your message defined, right? There's three questions that every salesperson should be asking themselves before they go into any given sale. And that is, why should this client want to see me? What do I want the client to do, and how can I provide value on that encounter? Those three things. And the why should this client see me? That's what Jane was talking about, right? Is what's the value proposition? Why should this, how can I actually help this person? Why should they even spend a couple of minutes with me? And then we need to go in with what we think is a good next step for the client, because that's what we're going to ask them to do at the end to keep the momentum going forward. And then the thing that's kind of wholly missing for most of the sales right now is, how can I provide value on the encounter? And that gets to what you were just saying, Carol, is that a lot of times salespeople go into a sales encounter thinking about what's in it for them. Right? They're thinking what they're going to get out of it. And if I could go back in time and give myself just one piece of advice, it would be just to get off yourself for a minute, forget about the sale, and just figure out how you can help these guys. If you'll do that, everything else will fall into place, right? I spent a lot of energy trying to, lean into the sale when it was totally unnecessary, and it's definitely counterintuitive.
That's so funny.
It's funny. As we talked about on the last call that we had, I picked up James's book shortly after I started here, and I've read it with my sales team. I've applied a lot of the concepts. So, but I picked it up and I latched onto it because from a values perspective, it really aligned with how I've approached sales as a profession, since I got started. Because if you had told me 25 years ago, when I got out of college, or longer, that I was going to have a very, successful, vibrant career in sales, I would have said, oh, no way, you're not me. And but when you think about it in terms of, and you approach it in terms of how I can help you, how do I help this client? What are you trying to accomplish? And how do I, does it make sense for us to even be talking? Can I help you? That is more of a partnership than it is a sales experience, and clients love that. They really, that's how you build trust. That's how you build, we want repeat customers. We want people who are confident in our ability to help them achieve their goals. And ultimately, where I sit, it's trying to, make a marketing team, be successful by feeding their pipeline. That's what our role is, as a media organization. And so, we've got some demonstrable results that we need to drive. And we need to understand what they do in order to do that, but not pressure them. There's no deadlines in the business that I work in anymore like there was, years ago when people were selling print magazines or dealing with one person. Now, just like a technology sale has gotten much more complex, we're dealing with, different budget holders that have different obligations to their organizations and different KPIs, and you need to try and string that all together in a way and keep things moving in a way that's going to not stall, is going to, you need to keep building a level of urgency where urgency doesn't exist, and also try to, as James said, coach the client and make sure that you're guiding them in the direction. And in the direction, the ultimate end outcome may be no, and that's okay, but there needs to be an outcome. There needs to be a close, because things that just don't go into, that don't ever end, then there's a definite flaw in the system, and that's where, I think that we need to, as leaders, sales leaders, get involved in terms of coaching and helping.
This idea of never getting to the no. In the world of email, it can be very difficult to you may never get that no, because people get that email and they don't want to respond back and say, I'm not interested, right? So like the no is almost like the person at the other end just not responding to you, and they think, well, that's the no, and the salesperson is left frustrated because they're trying to, as James says, make advanced steps, and Jane, you're saying create another encounter or a deeper engagement, but they come up against email and they think, well, how many times should I email this person? Assuming I can't call them or try to call them, and the person at the end is going, yeah, you don't understand that I'm sending you a virtual no by not even opening your email.
Right.
Yeah, just let me off the hook. Just let me.
I'm rejecting you, and you don't even know it.
I can relate to that. And a trick that I tried, this is some years ago, when I first started using emails, I would send 2 emails. I would send one email, which was my invitation, sort of my value prop email, and then I would follow it up with a Outlook invite and with a time on the calendar. And I didn't talk to them, so I have no idea whether that time works or not. But when they get that, they can just say no, right? They can accept it, they can decline it, or they can even suggest a new time. And I'm probably in the 80 percentile. I would get something back. I would get something back from that.
That's
and
high.
So, and that's 10 years ago. Today, there's even better technologies. Today, there's technologies that we can tell when they opened it. And we can look at we know exactly the day and the hour that they opened the email, how long they spent on it, if they forwarded on. So if you're investing in those technologies, there's technologies that'll tell you, oh, they did open it, they just don't want to reply to me, which is tells us something about the opportunity.
Right.
There's been times that I've applied, I call it the takeaway. I mean, we're talking about old strategies, but it's a tried and true. I've tried to reach you. I know, based on what I know about your organization, I know I can help you, but, I'm going to assume that, you're engaged with somebody else. You don't need my help. There's, whatever the reason may be. So this is the last time I'm going to reach out. And I'll tell you, 3/4 of the time, I get a response.
Oh.
It's like, no, I just didn't have time. You were buried. Blah, blah, blah. So that type of connection. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I was just going to throw some gas on that because I read a report just a couple weeks ago that said that about 90% of the non-response that you get is not because they're not interested. They just are too busy to get to you. And so that, as a salesperson, that's kind of a good thing to keep in mind, is that they're not really rejecting you. It's just that life is so busy, they're having a hard time getting to the thing that you're giving them. And so there is a challenge in that. And by the way, I think a key there is to craft our messaging in a way that makes what we're doing urgent enough to make it a high priority. I don't pretend that that's easy, but that's a critical thing, because what people do is they tend to work on what's urgent, not necessarily what's important. Yeah. And our job as salespeople is to try to illustrate why this important thing that we're approaching them with is also urgent.
And I would say that I of course get emails from people trying to sell me, and brevity, I think, for me is key. If I look at an email and I can see that it goes on and on and on, I mean, I may think, okay, I'm going to get back to it, but I never do. Like James said, you never get back to it, right? So, I mean, I think for me that's part of it. Like James was saying, get right to the point as to why it should be urgent, and don't, like, the old newspaper saying, don't bury the lead. I feel like people in email do that all the time. They bury the lead.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more.
Less is more. Less is more when it comes to our messaging.
Less is more. Well, believe it or not, we actually only have a couple minutes left of our time together. It goes by so fast. So maybe just a couple final thoughts to help the average salesperson out there or the sales manager in closing the deal. James, you mentioned, and perhaps you could repeat them again, those 3 questions. And by the way, go to Amazon and buy The Perfect Close by James Muir. But anyway, James, you should. But James,
definitely, I highly recommend it.
I highly recommend it. The 3 questions again that you said every salesperson should.
Yeah, the 3 questions. I mean, this is like the very most basic, super simple pre-call planning, right? Why should this customer see me? What do I want the customer to do? And how can I provide value on this encounter? If you just answered those 3 questions, that will make this listen to this podcast worth 10,000 times whatever time you invested into it, because those 3 things will make you super effective as a salesperson.
Great. And Jane, a couple tips for you that you give your salespeople for getting to that close.
Well, I think there's still some fundamental, fear of actually asking for the sale to some degree. So don't be afraid to ask for the sale. And if they're not ready, ask them what the natural next step is. So if you're not ready to make a decision, what is the next step? And this is something that James goes over in the book, and it was something that I learned years ago when I first started. But just to have that reinforced, you can ask for the sale without asking for the sale and still keep things moving forward in a very non-confrontational way that makes everybody comfortable and again, really positions you more as a partner to your customer versus a salesperson. Nobody wants to be sold to anymore. They need people who are vested in their success and really want to partner with them.
Yeah. James, Jane, thank you so much for your time today. We will have to do this again. I mean, we will definitely do this again.
Well, next time we can give them the whole perfect close. How's that sound?
I love that. I love that. We'll do chapter by chapter.
Oh my
Absolutely.
Goodness. Yeah. Well, Jane got close there. She did a good job. She did a good job right there.
Oh, no, it's great. You can learn more about James Muir and his book, The Perfect Close, at www.puremuir.com. You can find it on Amazon. Be sure you get there and Google that to learn what The Perfect Close is all about. And follow him on LinkedIn and on Twitter at B2B_sales tips. You can learn more about Jane Bogue at xtelligentmedia.com and follow her on Twitter at Jane in Maine. And that is the state of Maine. You can share your thoughts or comments on Twitter at #What'sMyTagline or visit the program page on healthcarenowradio.com. Have a topic related to our show you want to hear about? Or are you an expert who'd like to be on the show? Reach out to me on Twitter at Carol Flagg or email me at carol@healthcarenowradio.com. Until next time, I'm Carol Flagg, and I want to know, what's your tagline?